Hi there, everybody. My name is Steve, and this is my new channel. I'm starting it in close correlation to my primary YouTube channel, which goes under the name of Steve the Amateur Historian. I've had that channel up for years, hundreds of videos, and primarily history related, and I got this wild idea to start doing this series, and I just got done clearing a bunch of other stuff off of my Steve the Amateur Historian channel, and I felt like if I started putting this content on that channel as well, it was gonna start getting really cluttered and stuff was gonna get lost, and I was gonna be right back where I started. And I felt like this series, even though it's closely related to the content I'm doing on that channel, it can function very much as its own thing, because it's pretty simply put. I find an old story from the annals of history, mostly looking for like interesting, intriguing, often bizarre stories that were reported in a newspaper on a given date. So with today being March 10th, 2021, the story I'm going to bring to you today is a story that I found in print from a particular date, that being March 10th. And then, for each given video, it's probably going to be a different year, but it's really just a matter of finding interesting stories that came out at that exact date. So this is the beginning. I'm going to try to keep this up and do this, do a video for every single day, as is the purpose of this. And for those of you that are here watching, you're probably some of my first. Welcome. And you can look forward to daily content on this channel in the form of interesting and, again, often bizarre stories. So all that said, remember to like, subscribe, help my channel grow, as it is, at least at this point in my recording, is 0 subs, as makes sense. And like anything else, I want this channel to be able to grow, and I think people will really enjoy these odd little stories that I found. So with all that said, let's get to our inaugural episode. So you know how, especially the older folks, your grandparents and stuff, they're always telling you how rough it was growing up. Had to walk 20 miles to get to school in 10 feet of snow, uphill both ways, all that stuff. Trying to teach you it takes a lot to really survive and get things done in this world. Well, that brings us the story of W.R. Vaughn, who actually really lived out this experience. Published in a local paper, of course, on March 10th. Vaughn had been out, I guess, ice fishing a couple miles from where he lived in rural eastern Oregon. It says he lived in Cake, Oregon. Cake. I have no idea where that is. I'll try to find it on a map. I know the article references Baker, Oregon, was where a letter was received from him. So, I mean, he lived in Eastern Oregon. I just got to find out where Cake, Oregon is, out there in that, all of that nowhere. And he managed to get a letter to authorities telling them that he was essentially in a dire need. This guy was on his deathbed. He had gone out ice fishing on January 26th. So with it being March 10th, it's now been like a month and a half. He ended up falling through and he fractured his leg in multiple places. The article says that this guy had survived 3 different fractures. So he managed to pull himself up and literally drag his body through at what times was 2 feet of snow. Dragged himself through the muck and managed to get to this cabin, one of these random rural cabins that was out there, and dragged himself inside. And the problem was that with it being winter time, or it was, the dawning of spring, but at the time he arrived there, it was January. So the people who usually were using that cave were gone, and there was practically nothing there. There was no food. This guy had nothing to eat. He had a busted leg. He was probably very emotionally wrought, and he managed to fashion himself a sort of crutch support apparatus out of a chair that was left there. Apparently there was a broken chair there, and he just busted it into pieces and used some of the wood to fashion sort of a brace for his leg. And he said, this information all comes from his letter that he sent to authorities. And he sat in that cabin for about 3 days, kind of not knowing what to do. He was stranded, essentially. There was no food. He lived off of snow in the area to get his water intake. And after about 3 days, he decided, well, I'm either gonna die in here, you know, just wasting away, or I might survive if I try to get back home, which was approximately 2 miles away from this cabin that he'd been staying at, which that's quite a distance when your leg's all shattered. So his leg all, I guess, bandaged up the best he could, he began the pilgrimage 2-mile walk through, again, sometimes 2 feet of snow back to his cabin. And by his account, it took him nearly 19 hours to do this because he had to traverse all this snow. Just imagine it taking, I walked 2 miles in less than an hour. Granted, I'm a fast walker, but you get my point. It took this guy almost a day to traverse the 2 miles. He hasn't eaten in 3 days. It's freezing cold. It's still like the end of end of January, start of February. And this guy's, his leg's all busted up. But he finally makes it. He finally gets back to his own cabin, where at least he has some provisions. And by his account, right as he gets to the front door, it's right there in front of him, he slipped and fell and sustained another fracture. The article didn't say where he sustained this injury, if it was like another injury to his already busted leg, but he sustained another fracture. And he laid there right at the front entrance to his home. He said that he looked at the thermometer and it said it was 0 degrees outside. And he laid there for hours before finally, as he said, cutting away his clothing and doing his best to deal with this newfound fracture. And he slid himself into his home. Like, just insane. This guy hasn't eaten for pretty much 4 days by this point. He's been exposed to hours and hours of far below freezing temperatures out in the great eastern Oregon nowhere. But he finally manages to get into his cabin, and he's still alive. Vaughn then laid there in his cabin for more than a month. According to his letter, it was 35 days. And he said it was freezing cold the whole time. He was so dilapidated. Like, he could manage to eat some food, whatever he could make, but he was in such a weakened state that he couldn't even go outside to, like, cut or retrieve firewood to bring into his cabin to make a fire. And of course, way back in the day, that was how you established heat, especially in a cabin out in the middle of nowhere. So he could not even make a fire for himself. So he laid there, fractured up, like just in a very battered state, and he just survived freezing cold temperatures for a month. And I think about how much I complained. Recent ice storm that blew through here, we were without power for about 5 days, and by the 5th day I was ready to pull my already too long hair out of my head. And now I read this story and I'm like, you know, I probably would have been okay considering what this guy went through. Just insane. And he probably would have just, you know, he would have just laid there and laid there and laid there till he died. But to his great fortune, a guy that he knew in the area showed up at his house, or his cabin. And the main reason he showed up was that, you know, Vaughn would go to the nearest post office and pick up his mail. And here, you know, his mail had been piling up for over a month. So this guy went out to his cabin to see what was going on, probably half expected to find him dead from some set of circumstances. And that was how Vaughn was discovered in the state that he was in. So fortunately, this guy was able to get him some more provisions and provide him help. But, you know, so by the time he sent the letter, Vaughn was actually, you know, people knew where he was, people were able to get to him, but he was in dire need of provisions. And so the reason he wrote to authorities wasn't like, I'm still out here all alone, because how would he get the, you know, if somebody didn't find him, how would he even get a letter out to somebody? His biggest concern in his letter was he just need, and he was willing to pay for it, he just needed somebody to bring the provisions to his cabin. Because he said, considering, you know, the rough and tumble world that he was living in out there in Eastern Oregon, he said that, you know, it cost him about $200 to pay for all this stuff. But if he left his cabin and was gone for a prolonged period of time picking all this stuff up, he said he was assured that his cabin would be ransacked by various people of questionable moral value. And he said that that would have cost him a loss of $600 to $700. So it was cheaper this way. So he was just saying, please, I'll pay for it. Just bring the stuff to me so I don't have to leave my cabin and risk losing everything else that I have. Considering the fact that most cabins in the area had been deserted for the winter at that time, this guy was still there, tells me, well, this guy actually lived there. So this really was everything that he had. So by all accounts, in the end, Mr. Vaughn, as it would seem, things turned out probably okay for him. I mean, if this guy could survive all that, he could probably survive just about anything. A rough man of the woods. So if anybody comes at you and starts telling you those stories about, well, you won't believe what I had to go through. You think you got it rough? You have no idea what I went through growing up. But you know their backstory? Just pull this story out and tell it to them. But there was a guy named W.R. Vaughn who just about froze to death in the middle of nowhere with multiple fractured legs and nobody there to help him. It's a true story of survival. And that's the story for today. So, inaugural episode done, checked off. Thank you so much for watching the inaugural episode in the series again. These videos will be posted daily, as each day is a new date, so it will be kind of pointless for me to not post every day, unless, you know, an emergency comes along, some significant issue happens that requires me to not post on a given day. Hopefully that won't happen. And all that said, thank you so much for watching. Remember to like, share, subscribe. Oh, hello. Somebody's dog wanted to say hi very aggressively. I only really had one more thing to say before I go, which is that I do have a Patreon that, because this content is very closely related to my Steve the Amateur Historian content, I feel that my Patreon closely connects between the two, so I'll leave that link in the description below. There's also a link to my Facebook and Instagram pages that are closely related to the primarily historical content that I do and will be doing between this channel and my Steve the Amateur Historian channel. That's all I had left to say. Thank you again so much for watching. See you later.